Dr. Rebecca Thornfield adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses as she carefully lifted the glass plate negative from its protective sleeve. The basement archives of the Industrial Heritage Foundation were quiet except for the gentle hum of climate control systems maintaining the perfect temperature and humidity for preserving century-old photographic materials. As the lead archivist specializing in early American industrial photography, Rebecca had examined thousands of images documenting the rise of manufacturing in the early 1900s, but this particular collection had arrived with an unusual provenance. The donation had come from the estate of Harold Pemberton, a reclusive collector who had spent decades acquiring industrial artifacts and photographs. His nephew, clearing out the old man's Victorian mansion in Pittsburgh, had discovered boxes of glass plate negatives in a sealed room that hadn't been opened in over 50 years. The accompanying documentation was sparse, consisting mainly of handwritten notes in Pemberton's cramped script and a few yellowed newspaper clippings. Rebecca positioned the glass plate on the light table, its surface revealing the ghostly positive image that emerged when illuminated from below. The photograph showed the interior of what appeared to be a textile mill, with rows of massive looms stretching into the background. In the foreground, a group of workers had been arranged for what was clearly a formal company photograph. Men in work clothes and suspenders stood in neat rows, their faces bearing the serious expressions typical of early photography when exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still. The image quality was exceptional, a testament to the skill of whatever photographer had captured this moment in industrial history. Rebecca could make out individual threads on the workers' clothing, the intricate mechanical details of the looms, and even the texture of the wooden floor beneath their feet. She reached for her magnifying glass, beginning the methodical process of cataloging every detail visible in the photograph. As she examined the faces of the workers, Rebecca noted the typical demographics of early 20th century mill labor. Most appeared to be men in their 20s and 30s, though she could spot a few who looked barely old enough to be legally employed. Their clothing suggested this was likely a northern mill, possibly in Massachusetts or Connecticut, where working conditions were generally better than in the southern textile operations that relied heavily on child labor. Moving her magnifying glass across the image, Rebecca paused at one figure standing slightly apart from the main group. Unlike the other workers who were arranged in orderly rows, this man stood at the far left edge of the photograph, partially obscured by the shadow of a large loom. What caught her attention wasn't his position, but his clothing. While every other person in the image wore the rough work clothes typical of mill workers, this individual was dressed in a well-tailored dark suit with a white collar and what appeared to be a silk tie. Rebecca leaned closer, adjusting the magnification. The man's face was turned slightly away from the camera, making his features difficult to discern, but his posture and bearing suggested someone of higher social standing than the laborers surrounding him. Perhaps a supervisor or mill owner who had joined the photograph, though his positioning seemed oddly peripheral for someone of authority. She made a note to research the photograph's origins more thoroughly and moved on to examine the background details. The mill's architecture was impressive, with high ceilings supported by ornate iron columns and large windows that would have provided natural light for the workers. The machinery appeared to be state-of-the-art for the period, suggesting this was a prosperous operation with significant capital investment. A soft knock at the archive door interrupted her concentration. Dr. Michael Chen, her research assistant, entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. "I've been digging into the Pemberton collection," he said, setting one of the cups beside Rebecca's workspace. "Found some interesting background on how he acquired these photographs." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully. She had been working since early morning and hadn't realized how much time had passed. "What did you discover?" Michael opened the folder, revealing photocopied pages from what appeared to be auction catalogs and estate sale listings. Pemberton was obsessive about industrial photography, but he had a particular interest in what he called anomalous images. 5 photographs that contained unexplained elements or depicted events that didn't match historical records. "Anomalous in what way?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the direction this conversation was heading. "Look at this," Michael said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping dated 1957. The headline read, "Local collector claims historical photographs show evidence of time displacement." Pemberton gave an interview to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where he claimed to have documented several cases of people appearing in historical photographs who couldn't have been present when the images were taken. Rebecca sighed. She had encountered similar claims before, usually from amateur historians who let their imagination run wild when examining old photographs. Let me guess. He thought he had evidence of time travel. Something like that, Michael replied. But here's the interesting part. He wasn't some crackpot making wild claims. Pemberton had a doctorate in history from Carnegie Mellon and spent 30 years as a curator at the Heinz History Center. His colleagues described him as meticulous and conservative in his research methods. This gave Rebecca pause. Professional historians didn't typically stake their reputations on paranormal theories without compelling evidence. Did he publish any of his findings in academic journals? That's where it gets strange, Michael said, flipping through more documents. He submitted several papers to historical journals in the 1960s, but they were all rejected. Not because of methodological problems, but because the editors couldn't verify his photographic evidence. When other researchers requested to examine his collection, Pemberton refused access, claiming the materials were too fragile for handling. Rebecca looked back at the glass plate negative on her light table, focusing again on the well-dressed figure at the edge of the group. Did Pemberton leave any specific notes about this particular photograph? Michael consulted his folder. Actually, yes, this image was apparently one of his prize pieces. According to his notes, it was taken at the Riverside Cotton Mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, in April 1902. The mill employed about 200 workers at the time, and company records show that a group photograph was indeed taken that month for inclusion in a promotional brochure. So far, that all sounds perfectly normal, Rebecca observed. It does, Michael agreed. But Pemberton claimed he had identified the man in the suit, and according to his research, that individual couldn't possibly have been at the mill in 1902. Rebecca felt a familiar tingle of curiosity that always accompanied a good historical mystery. Who did he think it was? Michael pulled out a photocopy of a handwritten note in Pemberton's distinctive script. According to this, the man in the suit is Jonathan Blackwood, a textile engineer who worked for several New England mills in the early 1900s. Pemberton spent years tracking down employment records, payroll documents, and newspaper accounts of Blackwood's career. And Blackwood was definitely a real person, Michael continued. Born in 1875 in Boston, educated at MIT, worked as an engineer for various textile operations throughout New England. But here's the problem. In April 1902, when this photograph was supposedly taken, Jonathan Blackwood was 3,000 miles away in San Francisco, supervising the construction of a new mill that had been commissioned to help rebuild the city's textile industry. Rebecca set down her coffee cup and looked more closely at the figure in the photograph. How could Pemberton be certain about the identification? The man's face is partially obscured. That's what I wondered too, Michael said. But look at this. He produced another document, a photocopy of what appeared to be a formal portrait. The image showed a man in his late 20s with distinctive features, a prominent nose, deep-set eyes, and a small scar on his left cheek. This is a confirmed photograph of Jonathan Blackwood, taken in 1901 for a company directory. Pemberton claimed the facial structure and that scar were clearly visible in the mill photograph when examined under high magnification. Rebecca picked up her magnifying glass again, studying the shadowy figure with renewed interest. The image quality made it difficult to discern fine details, but she could see why someone might think they recognized specific facial features. Did Pemberton have access to better equipment than we do? Enhanced magnification or photographic analysis tools? Possibly, Michael replied. His notes mention using specialized optical equipment to examine the photographs, but he never specified what kind. Remember, this was the 1950s and 60s. Photographic analysis wasn't as advanced as it is today. Rebecca made a decision. I want to scan this image at the highest resolution possible and run it through our digital enhancement software. If there really is something anomalous here, modern technology should be able to reveal it. They spent the next hour carefully positioning the glass plate negative in the high-resolution scanner, adjusting settings to capture every possible detail. The resulting digital file was enormous, containing far more information than the human eye could discern from the original photograph. Rebecca loaded the image into professional photo analysis software and began the process of digital enhancement. As the computer processed the image, gradually sharpening details and adjusting contrast, Rebecca found herself thinking about Harold Pemberton. What would drive a respected historian to risk his professional reputation on claims of temporal anomalies? Either he had discovered something genuinely extraordinary, or he had fallen victim to the kind of obsessive pattern-seeking that sometimes afflicted researchers who spent too much time staring at historical documents. The enhanced image appeared on her monitor, and Rebecca immediately zoomed in on the figure at the edge of the group. The digital enhancement had indeed revealed details that were invisible in the original photograph. She could now clearly see the man's facial features, and the resemblance to the confirmed portrait of Jonathan Blackwood was striking. The prominent nose, the deep-set eyes, and most convincingly a small diagonal scar on the left cheek that matched exactly. "Michael," she called, her voice tight with excitement. "Come look at this." He hurried over to peer at the monitor. "That's definitely the same person," he said after a moment. "The facial features are identical, but how is that possible?" Rebecca was already pulling up the historical records Michael had compiled. "You said Blackwood was in San Francisco in April 1902. How certain are we about that?" "Very certain," Michael replied, consulting his notes. "There are multiple documented sources. Payroll records from the Pacific Textile Company showing he was on their payroll from February through August 1902. Newspaper articles in the San Francisco Chronicle mentioning his work on the new mill construction. Even a hotel registry showing he was staying at the Palace Hotel during that exact time period." Rebecca stared at the enhanced photograph, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Could this image have been taken at a different time? Maybe the dating is wrong. "Pemberton considered that possibility," Michael said. "But the mill records are very specific. The Riverside Cotton Mill only operated from 1898 to 1904, when it was destroyed in a fire. The group photograph was commissioned in April 1902 as part of a promotional campaign for new investors. There are invoices from the photographer, correspondence about the shoot, and the final brochure that included this image." Rebecca saved the enhanced image and leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. If the historical records were accurate, they were looking at a photograph that showed a man in two places at once, separated by the entire width of the continent. "There has to be a rational explanation," she murmured. "Maybe Blackwood had a brother or relative who looked similar." "Pemberton investigated that too," Michael said. "Jonathan Blackwood was an only child, and his family genealogy is well documented. No close relatives who could account for the resemblance." Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon diving deeper into the historical records, cross-referencing dates and locations, looking for any gap in the documentation that might explain Blackwood's apparent presence in Massachusetts when he should have been in California. But the more she researched, the more solid the evidence became. Jonathan Blackwood had definitely been in San Francisco in April 1902, working on a project that was extensively documented in contemporary sources. As evening approached, Rebecca found herself alone in the archives, Michael having left to attend a faculty meeting. She sat in the quiet basement, staring at the enhanced photograph on her monitor, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be historically accurate. The rational part of her mind insisted there had to be a mistake somewhere, a misidentification or misdating that would resolve the apparent contradiction. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to historical mysteries, wondered if Harold Pemberton had indeed discovered something extraordinary. What if there were phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional historical analysis? What if the past was more fluid and complex than academic orthodoxy assumed? Rebecca decided to approach the problem from a different angle. Instead of focusing on Jonathan Blackwood's documented presence in San Francisco, she would research his background more thoroughly, looking for any connection he might have had to the Riverside Cotton Mill or to Lowell, Massachusetts in general. She spent the next several hours combing through biographical records, employment histories, and newspaper archives. Jonathan Blackwood had been born in Boston in 1875 to a middle-class family. His father was a bookkeeper, his mother a seamstress. He had shown early aptitude for mathematics and engineering, earning a scholarship to study at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he graduated in 1896 with a degree in mechanical engineering. After graduation, Blackwood had worked for several textile mills throughout New England, gaining experience in the design and operation of industrial machinery. His career trajectory was typical for an ambitious young engineer of the period, moving from company to company as opportunities arose, gradually building a reputation for technical expertise and innovative problem-solving. In 1899, Blackwood had accepted a position with the Riverside Cotton Mill in Lowell, working as an assistant engineer under the supervision of the chief mechanical officer. According to the employment records, he had worked there for 2 years, from September 1899 through August 1901, when he had left to take a more senior position with a mill in Connecticut. Rebecca paused, rereading the employment dates. Blackwood had worked at the Riverside Cotton Mill, but he had left in August 1901, 8 months before the group photograph was taken. This seemed to resolve the mystery until she noticed something else in the records. According to a notation in the mill's personnel files, Jonathan Blackwood had returned to Riverside in March 1902 for a brief consulting assignment, helping to resolve technical problems with some newly installed machinery. The assignment was scheduled to last 6 weeks, from March 15th through April 30th, 1902. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. This consulting assignment would have placed Blackwood at the Riverside Cotton Mill during the exact time period when the group photograph was taken. But how could he have been in both Massachusetts and California simultaneously? She double-checked the San Francisco records, confirming that Blackwood's employment with the Pacific Textile Company was continuous throughout the first half of 1902. There was no gap in his California employment that would have allowed for a trip to Massachusetts. Rebecca printed out the relevant documents and spread them across her desk, creating a timeline of Blackwood's activities in early 1902. The evidence was contradictory but seemed reliable. Multiple independent sources placed him in San Francisco, while other equally credible sources indicated his presence in Massachusetts. As she studied the timeline, Rebecca noticed something odd about the dates. The consulting assignment at Riverside Cotton Mill was scheduled to begin on March 15th, but the first documented evidence of Blackwood's presence in San Francisco was a hotel registry entry dated March 20th. Could he have traveled from Massachusetts to California in that 5-day window? She consulted historical transportation records for early 1902. The transcontinental railroad journey from Boston to San Francisco typically took 5 to 6 days, assuming no delays or connection problems. It was theoretically possible for Blackwood to have been in Massachusetts on March 15th and California by March 20th, but the timing would have been extremely tight. More problematically, the mill records indicated that Blackwood's consulting work continued through April 30th, while the San Francisco documentation showed continuous presence throughout April. There was no way he could have been in both places during the overlapping period. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, frustrated by the apparent impossibility of reconciling the historical evidence. She was a trained historian, accustomed to dealing with incomplete or contradictory sources, but this case seemed to defy rational explanation. Either the documents were wrong, which seemed unlikely given their independent provenance, or something very unusual had occurred in 1902. She decided to take a different approach, focusing on the photograph itself rather than the historical records. Perhaps there were clues in the image that she had overlooked, details that might explain the apparent anomaly. Rebecca returned to the enhanced digital image, examining it with fresh eyes. She studied the positioning of the workers, the lighting conditions, the background details of the mill interior. Everything appeared consistent with a formal company photograph of the period. The workers were arranged in neat rows, their clothing and posture appropriate for the occasion. The lighting suggested the photograph had been taken during daytime hours, probably in the late morning, when natural light from the mill's windows would have been optimal. But as she examined the figure of Jonathan Blackwood more closely, Rebecca noticed something subtle but disturbing. While all the other workers in the photograph cast distinct shadows on the mill floor, consistent with the lighting conditions, Blackwood's figure appeared to cast no shadow at all. The wooden planks beneath his feet showed the same pattern of light and shadow as the surrounding area, as if he weren't physically present to block the light. Rebecca adjusted the image contrast and brightness, trying to determine if this was an artifact of the photographic process or a genuine anomaly. Early photography sometimes produced unusual effects due to exposure times, chemical processing, or optical distortions, but she had never seen anything quite like this. She zoomed in further, examining the edges of Blackwood's figure, where it should have interacted with the background. In most areas, the boundary between his clothing and the mill interior was sharp and well-defined, exactly what she would expect from a properly exposed photograph. But in certain spots, particularly around his feet and the lower edge of his coat, the image seemed to blend or fade in a way that suggested double exposure or some other photographic anomaly. Rebecca had seen double exposures before, usually the result of accidentally exposing the same photographic plate twice, but double exposures typically produced ghostly, translucent images where one exposure showed through another. Blackwood's figure appeared solid and opaque, indistinguishable from the other workers except for the subtle shadow and edge effects she had just noticed. She saved her enhanced analysis and decided to research the photographer who had taken the original image. Perhaps understanding the technical circumstances of the photograph's creation would provide clues about the apparent anomalies. The mill records indicated that the group photograph had been commissioned from Morrison and Associates, a commercial photography studio based in Boston that specialized in industrial and corporate work. Rebecca searched through business directories and newspaper advertisements from the period, gradually piecing together information about the company and its methods. Morrison and Associates had been established in 1895 by Thomas Morrison, a former apprentice to one of Boston's premier portrait photographers. The studio had built a reputation for high-quality commercial work, particularly large group photographs that required careful planning and technical expertise. Their client list included several major New England corporations, and their work was regularly featured in trade publications and promotional materials. Rebecca found a detailed article about Morrison's photographic techniques in a 1903 issue of American Photography magazine. The piece described his innovative approach to large group photography, including the use of specially designed lighting equipment and careful positioning to ensure that every subject was clearly visible and properly exposed. According to the article, Morrison was particularly proud of his ability to achieve sharp focus and even lighting across large groups, a technical challenge that defeated many photographers of the period. He used a combination of natural light from windows and strategically placed reflectors to eliminate shadows and ensure uniform illumination. This technical information made the shadow anomaly in Blackwood's image even more puzzling. If Morrison was known for his careful attention to lighting and shadow elimination, why would one figure in the photograph appear to cast no shadow while all the others showed normal shadow patterns? Rebecca continued reading about Morrison's methods and found a reference to his use of composite techniques for certain challenging assignments. The article was vague about the specific details, but it suggested that Morrison sometimes combined multiple exposures to achieve optimal results when photographing large groups in difficult lighting conditions. Could the Riverside Cotton Mill photograph be a composite image, combining separate exposures of the workers and the mill interior? This might explain the anomalous shadow and edge effects around Blackwood's figure, but it raised new questions about why he would have been photographed separately from the other workers and how his image had been so seamlessly integrated into the group composition. Rebecca decided she needed to consult with a photographic expert who specialized in early 20th century techniques. She made a note to contact Dr. Patricia Vance at the George Eastman Museum, who had written extensively about industrial photography of the period. As she prepared to leave the archives for the evening, Rebecca took one last look at the enhanced image on her monitor. Jonathan Blackwood stood at the edge of the group, his well-tailored suit and confident posture marking him as different from the mill workers surrounding him. His face, now clearly visible thanks to digital enhancement, bore an expression that seemed oddly knowing, as if he were aware of some secret that the other subjects didn't share. Rebecca saved her work and shut down the computer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The historical evidence seemed to indicate that Blackwood couldn't have been present when the photograph was taken, yet there he was, clearly visible in the enhanced image. The technical analysis suggested possible photographic manipulation, but the seamless integration of his figure into the composition argued against simple double exposure or composite techniques. As she walked through the quiet corridors of the foundation building toward the parking garage, Rebecca found herself thinking about Harold Pemberton's claims of temporal anomalies. She had initially dismissed them as the fantasies of an obsessed collector, but the evidence she had uncovered was genuinely puzzling. Perhaps Pemberton had been onto something after all. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the archives early, eager to continue her investigation. She had spent much of the night thinking about the Blackwood photograph, and she had developed a new theory about what might have happened. Instead of assuming that the image showed something impossible, she would work backward from the assumption that everything in the photograph was real and accurate, then try to construct a scenario that would explain the apparent contradictions in the historical record. Michael was already at his desk when she arrived, surrounded by stacks of documents and photocopies. "I've been doing some additional research on Jonathan Blackwood," he said without preamble. "I think I may have found something significant." Rebecca poured herself coffee and settled into her chair. "What did you discover?" "I was going through newspaper archives from San Francisco, looking for any mention of Blackwood's work there," Michael explained. "Most of the coverage was routine business reporting, but I found something interesting in the Chronicle's social pages." He handed her a photocopy of a newspaper clipping dated April 22, 1902. The headline read, "Prominent Engineer Hosts Reception for Eastern Investors." The brief article described a social gathering at the Palace Hotel, hosted by Jonathan Blackwood, to introduce potential investors to the Pacific Textile Company's expansion plans. "Look at the guest list," Michael said, pointing to a paragraph near the end of the article. Rebecca read the names, recognizing several prominent San Francisco businessmen of the period, but one name caught her attention: Mr. and Mrs. Charles Riverside of Lowell, Massachusetts, representing the Riverside cotton mill interests. "The Riverside family," Rebecca murmured. "The same family that owned the mill where Blackwood supposedly appeared in the photograph." "Exactly," Michael said. "And here's the interesting part. According to this article, Charles Riverside was in San Francisco on April 22nd, which means he wasn't in Massachusetts when the group photograph was taken at his mill." Rebecca considered the implications. "So, the mill owner was in California at the same time that Blackwood was supposedly in Massachusetts. That's an interesting coincidence, but I'm not sure what it tells us." "Maybe it's not a coincidence," Michael suggested. "What if there was some kind of business relationship between Blackwood and the Riverside family that we haven't uncovered? Something that might explain why he appeared in the mill photograph, even though he was officially working in California." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "That's worth investigating. Can you research the Riverside family's business interests? See if they had any investments or partnerships with California textile operations?" While Michael worked on tracing the Riverside family's business connections, Rebecca decided to follow up on her plan to consult with photographic experts. She placed a call to Dr. Patricia Vance at the George Eastman Museum, explaining her research and the puzzling aspects of the mill photograph. Dr. Vance listened with interest as Rebecca described the shadow anomalies and edge effects she had observed in the enhanced image. "What you're describing sounds like it could be evidence of spirit photography," she said, when Rebecca finished her explanation. Spirit photography. Rebecca was unfamiliar with the term. "It was a popular practice in the late 19th and early 20th centuries," Dr. Vance explained. "Photographers would claim to capture images of ghosts or spirits alongside living subjects. Most of it was deliberate fraud, accomplished through double exposure or other darkroom manipulation, but some cases were more sophisticated." Rebecca felt a chill at the suggestion. "Are you saying you think this might be a ghost photograph?" "Not necessarily," Dr. Vance replied. "But the technical characteristics you've described, particularly the lack of shadows and the subtle edge effects, are consistent with the methods used by spirit photographers. They would often photograph a subject separately, then composite the image with a group photograph, creating the appearance of a supernatural presence. But why would a commercial photographer like Morrison create a spirit photograph for a mill's promotional materials?" Rebecca asked. "That's a good question," Dr. Vance admitted. "Spirit photography was usually done for grieving families who wanted to believe they could communicate with deceased relatives. It would be very unusual to find it in an industrial context." After ending the call, Rebecca sat quietly in her office, considering the possibility that the Riverside cotton mill photograph might be an early example of manipulated imagery. But this explanation raised as many questions as it answered. Why would the mill owners want to include the image of someone who wasn't actually present? And why choose Jonathan Blackwood specifically? Michael returned with the results of his research into the Riverside family's business interests. "I found something very interesting," he announced, spreading documents across Rebecca's desk. The Riverside family didn't just own the cotton mill in Lowell. They had extensive investments in textile operations throughout the country, including a significant stake in the Pacific Textile Company in San Francisco. Rebecca looked up from the documents. "So, Charles Riverside was actually a business partner of Jonathan Blackwood's?" "More than that," Michael said. "According to these incorporation papers, Riverside was one of the primary investors in the San Francisco mill project. He had put up a substantial amount of capital and was actively involved in the planning and construction." This new information cast the April 22nd reception in a different light. Rather than a coincidental social gathering, it appeared to be a business meeting between partners. But it still didn't explain how Blackwood could have appeared in the Massachusetts photograph while simultaneously hosting investors in California. Rebecca decided to dig deeper into the timeline of events in April 1902. She created a detailed chronology of Blackwood's documented activities in San Francisco, cross-referencing them with the dates of the mill photograph and related events in Massachusetts. According to the San Francisco records, Blackwood had been continuously present in California throughout April, attending business meetings, supervising construction, and hosting social events for investors. The documentation was extensive and came from multiple independent sources: hotel registries, newspaper accounts, business correspondence, and construction reports. But as Rebecca examined the specific dates more carefully, she noticed something odd. While there was abundant documentation of Blackwood's presence in San Francisco during the first 3 weeks of April, there was a curious gap in the records from April 24th through April 27th. No hotel charges, no newspaper mentions, no business correspondence dated during those 4 days. The gap was followed by a flurry of activity starting April 28th, when Blackwood appeared to resume his normal schedule of meetings and social engagements. Rebecca checked the dates against the mill records and felt her pulse quicken. The group photograph at Riverside Cotton Mill had been taken on April 26th, right in the middle of the documentation gap. Could Blackwood have traveled from San Francisco to Massachusetts during those 4 days? Rebecca consulted railroad timetables from 1902. The fastest transcontinental service took approximately 5 days, which would have made a round trip impossible within the 4-day window. But what if he had only made a one-way trip, returning to California by some other means? She researched alternative transportation methods available in 1902. Commercial aviation didn't exist yet, but there were experimental flights being conducted by aviation pioneers. Could Blackwood have been involved in early aviation experiments? It seemed far-fetched, but Rebecca had learned not to dismiss any possibility without investigation. Her research into early aviation led to a surprising discovery. In April 1902, a series of experimental flights had been conducted in California by a group of inventors and engineers working on powered aircraft designs. The experiments were largely secret, funded by private investors who hoped to develop commercially viable flying machines. Rebecca found a brief mention of these experiments in a technical journal from 1903, which included a list of participants and financial backers. Jonathan Blackwood's name appeared on both lists. He had apparently invested in the aviation experiments and had participated as a test subject for some of the early flights. The journal article was frustratingly vague about the specific details of the experiments, noting only that significant progress was made in achieving sustained powered flight over considerable distances. But it did mention that one of the test flights had taken place on April 24th, 1902, the first day of the gap in Blackwood's documented presence in San Francisco. Rebecca felt a mixture of excitement and disbelief as she contemplated the implications. Could Jonathan Blackwood have participated in an experimental flight that transported him from California to Massachusetts in 1902, more than a year before the Wright brothers' famous flight at Kitty Hawk? It seemed impossible, but it was the only explanation she could find for his apparent presence in 2 places at once. She decided to research the aviation experiments more thoroughly, looking for any additional documentation that might support or refute this theory. The search led her to the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, which held papers related to early American aviation pioneers. After several phone calls and email exchanges, Rebecca gained access to a collection of documents related to the California aviation experiments of 1902. The materials had been donated to the Smithsonian in the 1960s by the estate of Dr. Marcus Whitfield, one of the principal investigators involved in the project. The Whitfield papers included detailed technical drawings, correspondence with investors, and most importantly, a daily log of experimental flights conducted between March and May 1902. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read through the log entries, looking for any mention of Jonathan Blackwood. On April 24, 1902, the log recorded a test flight involving subject JB, who was described as an experienced engineer with expertise in mechanical systems. The flight had lasted approximately 6 hours and had covered what the log described as an unprecedented distance for powered aircraft. The entry for April 26th was even more intriguing. Subject JB reported successful arrival at designated eastern destination. Communication received via telegraph confirming completion of transcontinental flight objective. Subject scheduled to return via conventional transportation methods. Rebecca read the entry several times, hardly believing what she was seeing. If subject JB was indeed Jonathan Blackwood, then these documents suggested that he had participated in a secret transcontinental flight in 1902, arriving in the eastern United States on April 26th, the exact date of the Riverside cotton mill photograph. But how could such a significant achievement in aviation history have remained secret? The Wright brothers' 12-second flight at Kitty Hawk in December 1903 was celebrated as the first powered flight in history. If Blackwood had flown across the continent more than a year earlier, why wasn't this achievement widely known? Rebecca continued reading through the Whitfield papers, looking for answers. She found them in a series of letters between Dr. E. Carr, Whitfield and his financial backers, written in the months following the experimental flights. The letters revealed that the aviation project had been terminated abruptly in May 1902, following what was described as a catastrophic failure during a test flight. The specific details were not provided, but the correspondence suggested that the failure had resulted in the loss of both the experimental aircraft and its pilot. More ominously, the letters indicated that the project's investors had agreed to suppress all information about the experiments, fearing that news of the catastrophic failure would damage public confidence in aviation development and harm their other business interests. All documentation related to the transcontinental flight experiments must be secured and held in strictest confidence, one letter stated. The public is not ready for such revolutionary technology, and the unfortunate outcome of our final test demonstrates the premature nature of our efforts. Rebecca felt a chill as she read these words. Had Jonathan Blackwood been the pilot who died in the catastrophic failure? If so, how could he have appeared in the mill photograph, and how could he have continued his documented activities in San Francisco after April? She searched through the remaining documents for any mention of casualties or fatalities, but found only vague references to the loss of our most experienced test pilot and the tragic end to subject JB's participation in the project. The final document in the collection was a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only in the event of public disclosure of the transcontinental flight experiments." Inside, Rebecca found a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note from Dr. Whitfield. "For the record, I must state that the events of April and May 1902 challenge our understanding of the natural world. Subject JB successfully completed the transcontinental flight as documented, arriving in Massachusetts on April 26th. However, the subject also maintained continuous presence in California throughout the same period, as verified by multiple independent witnesses. I have no scientific explanation for this apparent impossibility. The catastrophic failure of May 15th resulted in the complete disappearance of both aircraft and pilot, though subject JB continued to appear in California for several days afterward, before vanishing entirely. I fear we have tampered with forces beyond our comprehension." Rebecca set down the document with shaking hands. Dr. Whitfield's note suggested that Jonathan Blackwood had somehow existed in two places simultaneously during April 1902, participating in secret aviation experiments in California, while also appearing at the Riverside cotton mill in Massachusetts. The note also indicated that Blackwood had disappeared entirely following the catastrophic failure in May, which would explain why his documented presence in San Francisco ended abruptly at that time. But how could any of this be possible? Rebecca was a trained historian, committed to rational analysis and evidence-based conclusions, yet the documentation she had uncovered seemed to point towards something that defied scientific explanation. She decided to verify Dr. Whitfield's claims by researching what had happened to Jonathan Blackwood after May 1902. If he had indeed disappeared, as the aviation documents suggested, there should be some record of his fate in conventional historical sources. Her search through biographical databases and newspaper archives confirmed that Jonathan Blackwood's documented life had ended abruptly in May 1902. The last verifiable record of his existence was a hotel registry entry from the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, dated May 14th. After that date, he seemed to vanish from the historical record entirely. Rebecca found no death certificate, no obituary, no estate records, no correspondence from family or colleagues inquiring about his whereabouts. It was as if Jonathan Blackwood had simply ceased to exist on May 15th, 1902, the same date that Dr. Whitfield had recorded the catastrophic failure of the aviation experiment. The implications were staggering. If the documents were accurate, Jonathan Blackwood had participated in secret transcontinental flights that allowed him to appear simultaneously in California and Massachusetts. The technology that made this possible had apparently been lost when Blackwood disappeared in the experimental aircraft, taking the secret of his impossible journeys with him. Rebecca spent the rest of the day trying to find alternative explanations for the evidence she had uncovered. Could the documents be forgeries? Could there have been two different people named Jonathan Blackwood? Could the dates be wrong, or the identifications mistaken? But every avenue of investigation seemed to confirm the impossible story. The documents appeared authentic, the dates were consistent across multiple independent sources, and the photographic evidence clearly showed the same individual in both locations. As evening approached, Rebecca found herself alone in the archives again, staring at the enhanced image of the Riverside cotton mill photograph. Jonathan Blackwood stood at the edge of the group, his figure casting no shadow, his edges slightly blurred as if he weren't entirely present in the same reality as the other workers. She thought about Harold Pemberton, the collector who had spent decades accumulating evidence of temporal anomalies in historical photographs. Had he uncovered other cases like this one? Were there other individuals who had somehow transcended the normal limitations of time and space, leaving behind photographic evidence of their impossible journeys? Rebecca made a decision. She would continue investigating the Pemberton collection, looking for other photographs that might contain similar anomalies. If Jonathan Blackwood's story was true, it was possible that he wasn't the only person who had discovered ways to exist in multiple places simultaneously. Over the following weeks, Rebecca threw herself into the investigation with an intensity that concerned her colleagues. She examined every photograph in the Pemberton collection, using digital enhancement techniques to search for figures that didn't belong, shadows that fell wrong, or faces that appeared in impossible contexts. Gradually, she began to find them. A woman in Victorian dress standing in the background of a 1920 factory photograph, her clothing and hairstyle decades out of date. A man in a Union Army uniform appearing in a group portrait of Confederate veterans taken in 1895. A child whose face appeared in multiple photographs, taken in different cities on the same date. Each anomalous figure was subtle, easily overlooked by casual examination, but clearly visible when subjected to careful analysis. And in each case, Rebecca was able to trace the individual's documented history, finding evidence that they couldn't have been present when the photographs were taken. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. The anomalous figures were always people who had been involved in experimental or cutting-edge technology of their time. Engineers working on early aviation projects, inventors developing new forms of transportation, scientists exploring the boundaries of physics and chemistry. It was as if certain individuals had gained access to technologies or knowledge that allowed them to transcend normal temporal and spatial limitations, appearing in multiple places simultaneously or traveling through time in ways that left photographic evidence but no other historical trace. Rebecca compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, documenting each case with enhanced photographs, historical research, and technical analysis. The evidence was compelling, but she knew that publishing such claims would be professional suicide. No academic journal would accept a paper arguing for the existence of time travel or dimensional displacement based on photographic evidence. Instead, she decided to follow Harold Pemberton's example, keeping her discoveries private while continuing to search for additional evidence. She established a secure archive for the anomalous photographs, documenting each case in detail while maintaining strict confidentiality about her findings. As she worked, Rebecca began to notice something troubling. The anomalous figures in the photographs seemed to be aware of her investigation. In several cases, when she examined enhanced images of faces that had appeared in impossible contexts, the subjects seemed to be looking directly at the camera with expressions of knowing awareness, as if they understood that they were being observed across the decades by someone who could see through their temporal disguises. The realization that she might be under observation by individuals from the past filled Rebecca with a mixture of excitement and dread. If these people had truly mastered technologies that allowed them to transcend normal limitations of time and space, what other capabilities might they possess? And why had they chosen to reveal themselves through photographic evidence that could only be detected by careful analysis decades later? Rebecca's investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered a photograph in the Pemberton collection that showed a figure she recognized. Standing in the background of a 1935 industrial exposition photograph was Harold Pemberton himself, clearly visible despite the fact that he would have been only 12 years old at the time and living in a different state. The enhanced image showed Pemberton as an adult, wearing the same style of clothing and bearing the same facial features that appeared in photographs from his later life. He stood among a group of engineers and inventors, his presence unremarkable, except for the impossibility of his being there. Rebecca realized that Pemberton hadn't just been a collector of anomalous photographs. He had been one of the anomalous figures himself, somehow gaining access to the same temporal displacement technology that had allowed Jonathan Blackwood and the others to appear in multiple times and places. This discovery led Rebecca to examine Pemberton's personal history more carefully. She found evidence that he had been involved in various experimental projects throughout his career, always working on the cutting edge of technology and scientific understanding. His official biography described him as a historian and collector, but the deeper she dug, the more she found connections to classified research projects and experimental programs. In the basement of Pemberton's mansion, his nephew had discovered not just the photographic collection, but also technical drawings, scientific instruments, and what appeared to be components of some kind of experimental apparatus. The nephew had donated these materials to the foundation, along with the photographs, but they had been catalogued separately and stored in a different archive. Rebecca requested access to these technical materials, hoping to find clues about the technology that had enabled Pemberton and the others to transcend normal temporal limitations. What she found exceeded her wildest expectations. Among Pemberton's papers was a detailed technical manual describing the construction and operation of what he called a temporal displacement device. The manual was written in Pemberton's handwriting and included precise engineering drawings, mathematical calculations, and step-by-step instructions for building the apparatus. According to the manual, the device worked by creating what Pemberton described as localized distortions in the fabric of spacetime, allowing the operator to exist simultaneously in multiple temporal and spatial locations. The technology was based on principles that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream science for decades, involving concepts that Rebecca recognized from modern quantum physics and relativity theory. The manual also included a historical section that traced the development of temporal displacement technology from its origins in the late 19th century through its refinement in the early 20th century. According to Pemberton's account, the technology had been discovered independently by several inventors and scientists, each working in secret due to the revolutionary nature of their findings. Jonathan Blackwood had been one of the early pioneers, using a primitive version of the technology to participate in the transcontinental aviation experiments while maintaining his presence in San Francisco. The catastrophic failure that had ended the aviation project had resulted from an attempt to push the technology beyond its safe limits, causing Blackwood to become permanently displaced from normal space-time. Other pioneers had learned from Blackwood's fate, developing safer and more controlled applications of the technology. They had formed a secret society of temporal researchers, sharing knowledge and resources while maintaining strict secrecy about their capabilities. Pemberton had been inducted into this society in the 1920s, gaining access to advanced displacement technology that allowed him to travel through time and space while maintaining his normal life as a historian and collector. His collection of anomalous photographs had been assembled not through chance discoveries, but through deliberate documentation of the Society's activities across multiple time periods. The manual concluded with a warning about the dangers of temporal displacement technology. Prolonged use could result in what Pemberton called temporal fragmentation, a condition in which the user became permanently scattered across multiple time periods, unable to maintain coherent existence in any single timeline. Several members of the Society had suffered this fate, becoming ghostly figures who appeared briefly in photographs and historical records before fading away entirely. Pemberton himself had begun to experience symptoms of temporal fragmentation in his later years, which explained his increasing reclusiveness and his decision to donate his collection to the Foundation. Rebecca finished reading the manual with a mixture of awe and terror. The technology described in Pemberton's notes represented a revolutionary breakthrough in human understanding of time and space, but it also posed enormous dangers to anyone who attempted to use it. She found herself faced with an impossible decision. Should she attempt to reconstruct Pemberton's temporal displacement device, potentially gaining access to capabilities that would revolutionize human civilization? Or should she destroy the manual and its dangerous knowledge, protecting humanity from technology that could fragment reality itself? As she contemplated this choice, Rebecca noticed that the enhanced photograph of Jonathan Blackwood had changed. Where before he had stood at the edge of the mill workers, casting no shadow and slightly blurred at the edges, now he appeared to be looking directly out of the photograph at her, his eyes filled with an expression of urgent warning. Rebecca realized that her investigation had attracted the attention of the temporal researchers, both living and fragmented. They were watching her across the decades, waiting to see what she would do with the knowledge she had uncovered. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming. Rebecca understood that her decision would have consequences that extended far beyond her own life, potentially affecting the entire course of human history. The technology that had allowed Jonathan Blackwood to exist in two places at once was still out there, still being used by members of the secret society who had learned to navigate the dangers of temporal displacement. But it was also technology that had claimed victims, fragmenting them across time and space until they existed only as ghostly images in old photographs. The price of transcending normal limitations was the risk of losing coherent existence entirely. Rebecca made her choice. She carefully photographed every page of Pemberton's manual, creating a complete digital record of the temporal displacement technology. But instead of attempting to build the device herself, she sealed the original documents in a secure vault, accessible only to future researchers who might be better equipped to handle such dangerous knowledge. She also prepared a detailed report of her investigation, documenting the evidence for temporal displacement technology, while carefully omitting the specific technical details that would allow others to reconstruct the devices. The report would serve as a warning to future historians and scientists, alerting them to the existence of temporal anomalies, while protecting them from the temptation to experiment with forces beyond their understanding. As Rebecca completed her work on the Blackwood case, she found herself changed by the experience. She had discovered evidence of technologies and capabilities that challenged everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. The past was not the fixed, immutable record she had always believed it to be, but a fluid and complex landscape where determined individuals could transcend normal limitations at the cost of their coherent existence. The photograph of Jonathan Blackwood remained in her files, a reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden in the historical record. Sometimes, when she worked late in the archives, Rebecca would glance at the enhanced image and see Blackwood's eyes following her movements, a temporal refugee watching from across more than a century of displaced time. She never attempted to contact the secret society of temporal researchers, Though she suspected, they were aware of her investigation and her decision to protect their secrets. Occasionally, she would notice anomalous figures in contemporary photographs, people whose presence seemed slightly out of place, or whose shadows fell at impossible angles. Rebecca understood that she had become a guardian of dangerous knowledge, responsible for protecting humanity from technologies that could fragment reality itself. It was a burden she carried alone, knowing that the truth about temporal displacement was too dangerous to share, but too important to forget. The Riverside cotton mill photograph remained one of her most treasured possessions, a window into a hidden world where the boundaries of time and space could be transcended by those brave or foolish enough to attempt the journey. Jonathan Blackwood stood forever at the edge of the group, a man who had existed in two places at once and paid the ultimate price for his temporal ambitions. In her final report on the case, Rebecca wrote, "The photographic record of the past contains mysteries that challenge our understanding of the natural world. While we must approach such anomalies with scientific skepticism, we must also remain open to the possibility that human ingenuity has occasionally transcended the limitations we assume to be absolute." The figure of Jonathan Blackwood in the Riverside cotton mill photograph serves as a reminder that history may be far stranger and more complex than we dare to imagine. Years later, when Rebecca had retired from her position at the Industrial Heritage Foundation, she would sometimes return to the archives to examine the Pemberton collection. The anomalous photographs remained as mysterious as ever, their temporal refugees frozen in moments that defied rational explanation. She never revealed the full truth about what she had discovered, taking Pemberton's secrets with her to the grave. But she left behind a legacy of careful documentation and thoughtful analysis, ensuring that future researchers would have the tools they needed to uncover the truth about temporal displacement technology. When humanity was ready to handle such revolutionary knowledge, the photograph of Jonathan Blackwood continued to puzzle historians and photography experts who examined it in later years. Some dismissed it as an early example of photographic manipulation, while others argued for more exotic explanations involving optical illusions or chemical anomalies in the development process. But Rebecca knew the truth. Jonathan Blackwood had been there in that mill in April 1902, standing among the workers, while simultaneously existing 3,000 miles away in San Francisco. He had achieved something that mainstream science still considered impossible, transcending the normal limitations of time and space through technologies that remained hidden from public knowledge. The price of his achievement had been his coherent existence, fragmenting him across multiple timelines until he became a ghostly figure appearing in photographs but unable to maintain stable presence in any single reality. He served as both an inspiration and a warning, demonstrating the incredible potential of human ingenuity, while illustrating the dangers of pushing beyond the boundaries of natural law. Rebecca's investigation had revealed that the past was far more complex and mysterious than anyone had imagined. Hidden within the photographic record were evidence of technologies and capabilities that could revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. But such knowledge came with enormous responsibilities and terrible risks, requiring careful guardianship by those wise enough to understand its implications. The figure of Jonathan Blackwood would continue to stand at the edge of that factory photograph, a temporal refugee from an age of secret experiments and impossible achievements. His story served as a reminder that human ambition and ingenuity could transcend any limitation, but that some boundaries existed for good reason and should be crossed only by those prepared to pay the ultimate price. In the end, Rebecca's investigation had uncovered not just a historical mystery, but a profound truth about the nature of human potential and the hidden complexities of reality itself. The photograph of a man who shouldn't have been there had opened a window into a world where the impossible became possible, where the past and present could coexist, and where the boundaries of time and space were merely obstacles to be overcome by those bold enough to attempt the journey.